From the Ear to There Travel Studio, this is the Ear to There Disney Podcast.
The Ear to There Podcast, it's time to start the show. Be sure to hold on tight, here we go. Exploring all the different Disney destinations. Ear to There, it's time to start the fun.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ear to There Podcast, Walt Disney World Word of the Week. I'm your host, Phil Gramlich, and each and every week I will bring you a different Walt Disney World word and then give you all kinds of tips, tricks, hints, history, stories, background, all kinds of stuff about that word. Think of it as like Disney in a minute, but instead it's like Disney in 15 minutes or sometimes 25 minutes. I try to give you your quick fix of Disney in each of these episodes. So here we go. So this is the fun one, right? So this week's word of the week is brought to you by the letter M. M for mansion. Yeah, keeping with the time of the year, it's late October of 2017. This week, I wanted to talk all about the history and the stories behind the Haunted Mansion. Now, the Haunted Mansion opened on August 9th, 1969 in Disneyland. It actually opened just 2 short years later with the Magic Kingdom in Walt Disney World. But before it opened in Disneyland, it had been on the drawing board since before construction for Disneyland even began. As a matter of fact, 20 years before Disneyland was actually a real-life park, Walt Disney already had plans to include a haunted house attraction in his Mickey Mouse park or whatever kind of park he was going to build. So why did it take 14 years after Disneyland opened for the Haunted Mansion to premiere? Well, that's what I'm going to talk about on this week's Word of the Week. What happened? What was the process like? And why did it take that long? And why did it not debut until after Walt Disney had passed away? So in the 1950s, when Walt had Imagineers, but they weren't called that back then, of course, but when he had plans drawn up for his Mickey Mouse park, he had plans for a church, graveyard, and haunted house, and that's in quotes, that would be in that park. These kinds of attractions were already super popular in the 1950s in amusement parks, so it just kind of made sense to include a haunted house attraction in his Mickey Mouse park. The problem that the haunted house idea always had was, in a family-friendly park, should this haunted house be scary or should it be funny? And that was the main issue that kind of plagued the Haunted Mansion for years. So in 1957, Walt started thinking, hey, listen, this park just isn't complete without a haunted house. So he went to Disney animator, illustrator, and new Imagineer Ken Anderson. And he tasked Ken Anderson with coming up with concepts, with ideas for his haunted house. So Ken got right to work in designing the exterior of the mansion. So he was flipping through some historical architectural, that's hard to say, documents where he came across the Shipley Lydecker House in Baltimore, Maryland. This house was already a 150-year-old home at the time, and it's actually not still around. It was torn down, but if you Google Shipley-Lydecker, Lydecker house, you will find that, amazingly, the picture of that old house looks almost exactly like the Haunted Mansion exterior in Disneyland. Now, Ken Anderson also visited the Winchester Mystery House in San Jose, California. Basically, the idea for this house is that it's haunted by the spirits of those that were killed by Winchester weapons. So yeah, the same Winchester, like the rifle, that was the home that he visited. It's rumored to be haunted, and it's also kind of a creepy house. It's still open to the public as a tourist destination to this day in 2017, and you can go and check it out. It has like doors that lead to nowhere, and there are stairs that lead to nowhere. There's even a seance room, so you can kind of see where Ken Anderson started getting some of his ideas from. So when it came to creating the actual interior of the attraction and pitching what the ride would be all about, Ken Anderson went through several different iterations of exactly what it would be. And what's really cool is there are still elements today in the finished attraction of these proposals that ultimately were kind of not really shot down, but you know what? Yeah, they were shot down. He had all of these ideas, and I believe, just from doing the research, that they were all kind of creepy and maybe a little too creepy for a family-friendly park. So let me take you through his proposed ideas, and then you can kind of judge for yourself. So the first idea was that an old sea captain named Captain Gore was getting married to his new fiancée named Priscilla. Now, Captain Gore had to hide his old pirate days from Priscilla, so he hid all of his artifacts, all of his relics in the attic of this old mansion. And he told Priscilla, look, Priscilla, don't go up in the attic and start looking through my stuff, okay? That's my stuff. That has nothing to do with you. Just don't go up there and look at it. So they got married, and Priscilla just couldn't help herself. So she went up there, opened the door to the attic, and discovered that here he was, her new husband, was this horrible, murderous sea captain. And guess what? Captain Gore apparently comes up behind her in the attic, sees her going through his stuff, knows she put two and two together, and he throws her out the attic window. So to kind of, drive home the point of the story, Ken Anderson had a bride in a wedding dress appearing throughout the attraction after her death. And to round the story out, Captain Gore was so guilty and so haunted by the death, by his murder of his new wife, that he hung himself in the rafters of the mansion. So there you see some of Ken Anderson's original story ideas are still in the mansion itself today. You have the bride in the wedding dress in the attic and at the end of the attraction. And you also, of course, have the famous hanging man in the pre-show of the mansion itself. So that's a rough one. So Ken Anderson's next idea, his next pitch for the attraction kind of went like this. There was once an old southern mansion called Bloodmere Manor. It was named Bloodmere after the Blood family that lived in this mansion. So the Blood family died off, and there were rumors that the patriarch of the Blood family was once a ruthless, terrible pirate. So Bloodmere Manor remained deserted. No one wanted to buy it because it was rumored to be haunted. So in steps Walt Disney, according to the story, and he decides, you know what? I always wanted this haunted house attraction in my park, so I'm going to buy this Bloodmere Manor and move it brick by brick to Disneyland and then have it installed in my park. So the idea was that they would move the Bloodmere Manor to Disneyland, to New Orleans Square, but in transport, and while they were taking it down and then putting it back up, there would be all kinds of injuries and hauntings and scary things that happened to these construction workers and to these people who were getting it ready to move and then getting it ready to open in Disneyland. The idea was that Disney would, quote unquote, leak these stories to the press to kind of build up the anticipation for this haunted attraction that, again, was the once real home of this Blood family called Bloodmere Manor. Disney would then deny, but then eventually would own up to it when an unfortunate worker was walled into the construction of Bloodmere Manor in Disneyland, and then they would, quote unquote, abandon the project. So yeah, that's also really, really creepy, right? And if you don't think this is a little bit creepy, you're tougher than me, because I sure do. So then there was another concept that Ken Anderson came up with that incorporated the legend of Sleepy Hollow into the Haunted Mansion. So in that version, the guests who were going through the Haunted Mansion would relive the movie of The Legend of Sleepy Hollow through the characters Ichabod Crane and the Headless Horseman. But Ken Anderson decided that telling that backstory and incorporating that into the beginning of the attraction would take way too long and kids would be bored and it just wouldn't work. So that pitch didn't work and didn't win out either. See, the ultimate problem that Ken Anderson ran into was he had the idea of the Haunted Mansion being this ratty, rundown, old up on a hill kind of building. But Walt Disney had invested his life and his savings into Disneyland, and Disneyland was this immaculate, beautiful place. So Walt, didn't like the idea of this rundown, beat up old house that he would have to invest millions of dollars into if it didn't jive with the rest of the feel of the park. So Walt put everything on hold, but the Disneyland marketing team didn't get the email. Well, it was 1958. They didn't get the smoke signals. That's a bad joke. Anyway, Disney marketing didn't get the memo from Walt. And even though New Orleans Square hadn't even broken ground yet, the Haunted Mansion was included on the park maps in 1958. Obviously, the Haunted Mansion wasn't ready to go in 1958, and Haunted Mansion was removed from the maps in 1959, 1960, 1961, and 1962. Construction on New Orleans Square started in 1961, and the exterior, the outside, the part of the Haunted Mansion that guests actually see the outside of the attraction, the facade. It took me a while to get to that word. The facade was actually built, and it was built in the style of the Shipley Lydecker house. So even though the rest, the interior, the theme, the whole concept of the Haunted Mansion attraction was still totally up in the air, people in the organization still liked that exterior of the attraction. So that was built according to Ken Anderson's original sketches. So Disneyland cast members were handing out these flyers for the Haunted Mansion as early as 1963, advertising that it would be open that year. Well, that didn't work out. Obviously, again, Walt Disney was pulled away from the project and had to focus more on the attractions that were going into the 1964-1965 World's Fair in New York. So that took his attention away from the project pretty dramatically. And Walt always saw his haunted house, his Haunted Mansion, as a walk-through attraction. And the Imagineers were totally stuck on how to accomplish that. They couldn't figure out how to move guests through at a consistent pace. They didn't know if it was going to be guided, because if it was unguided, they were worried that guests would just be wandering, forward and backward and all throughout the attraction. So it really caused a lot of problems in the design phase of the Haunted Mansion. Now that was, of course, until Bob Gurr invented the Doom Buggies. The Doom Buggies are the black clamshell-like vehicles that you still ride in to this day on the Haunted Mansion. He had developed the on-the-mover system for attractions in the World's Fair in New York, and finally Walt Disney agreed to use those style ride vehicles for his Haunted Mansion. So then it looked like the project was finally going to move forward, but unfortunately with Walt's untimely death in 1966, the project was again put on hold. Now imagine being a Disneyland guest, and you very well may have. I'm sure I have a bunch of listeners out there who were frequenting Disneyland in the 60s, but imagine being there and being in the park fairly often and seeing that facade for the Haunted Mansion and being like, why can't I ride? This thing's been here for years. That had to be super frustrating for people. Anyway, so in the years after Walt's death, then the age-old argument came back between the Imagineers. Should it be funny or should it be scary? Mark Davis, who worked on Pirates of the Caribbean and the Country Bear Jamboree and was responsible for giving kind of a little bit of levity to a lot of the Disney attractions, he was on the funny side. He thought, listen, this attraction has to be funny in order for it to fit into a family-friendly park. On the other side of the argument was Disney legend, not at the time, but he eventually became a Disney legend, Claude Coates. So what did they do? Well, I want to say they compromised, but it's almost like they didn't come to complete agreement. What ended up happening is the Haunted Mansion became a combination of scary, of funny, of all the wonders that Walt wanted to be put into the attraction. And some of those elements that Ken Anderson originally came up with in the 50s made their way into the Haunted Mansion as well. Of course, other Imagineers and eventual Disney legends worked on the gags and the scenes in the Haunted Mansion over the years. And many of those gags and those scenes made their way into the finished version. So Yale Gracie and Rolly Crump were tasked by Walt Disney himself in the early days of the attraction to come up with all kinds of different sight gags and scary things that would appear in the attraction as you were walking through. So Yale Gracie came up with the idea and the concept of the singing busts that are still there in the Haunted Mansion to this day. No, that one is not Walt Disney. It is actually Thurl Ravenscroft. Just wanted to throw that out there. They also came up with the idea of using the Pepper's ghost effect in the attraction. So when you go through the ballroom scene and you see all the ghosts dancing and sitting at the table and playing the pipe organ and flying around, that was all done and still is done using a very old technique, even in the 50s and 60s, called Pepper's Ghost. Now, one thing that Rolly Crump and Yale Gracie worked on that did not, well, a lot of things didn't make their way into the attraction. But one of the more famous ones was the Hatbox Ghost illusion. That was when you would go to the Hatbox Ghost, he would have a hatbox under his arm, and you would see his face originally on his body, his head on his body. And then as you were to walk or eventually ride past him, that head would disappear on his shoulders and end up in the box under his arm. Now, Rolly and Yale Gracie tried to get this to work by opening day for the Haunted Mansion. It did not, so the idea was scrapped. But if you ride Disneyland's Haunted Mansion now, that Hatbox Ghost concept has been introduced to the attraction. So, like I said, the Haunted Mansion debuted in Disneyland in 1969. And of course, it debuted in Walt Disney World on October 1st, 1971. And that is going to do it for this week's episode of the Ear to There podcast, Walt Disney World Word of the Week. As always, thank you so much for listening. This is a really fun episode. I love going back and looking at the history of attractions. And Haunted Mansion, as I'm sure you know, is one of my favorites, and it's probably one of your favorites too. It's one of those like truly classic Disneyland or Disney World attractions. So it's really fun to kind of take a look back and see where it came from, and I really like that kind of stuff. So again, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you really liked it. If you did, please tell someone about it. It's Halloween time. There's somebody you know in your life that's a Haunted Mansion fan. I'd really appreciate it if you shared this episode with them, or you could always hit share on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, even though you can't listen to it on Instagram. Or you can share it on Snapchat somehow. I don't know how that works, but somehow you can. I've tried Snapchat, man. I just can't get into it. I've worked on it. I've had it on my phone, then I took it off my phone, put it back on my phone, and I think I'm too old. I'm 38. I think I'm too old for Snapchat. Pass me by. All right. So Just remember, there will be a new episode of the Ear to There podcast, Walt Disney World Word of the Week, each and every Wednesday morning, as well as a new episode of the regular Ear to There podcast. That's each and every Monday morning. So until next time, thank you again so much for listening. You were awesome. I really hope you enjoyed the episode once again. Have a fantastic week, a very, very happy Halloween, and I will talk to you soon. Bye-bye.